from conflicts, mineral sourcing to child labor, negligence, and many other forms of human rights violations, Africans have been made victims as a result of their wealth. Today on the debrief, we will be having a conversation with someone who spent decades of his life calling big corporations to order and also ensuring that they pay for human rights violations in different parts of the world. Now, Terry Collingsworth is my guest today, and he's an experienced international human rights attorney with a focus on litigating international human rights cases and leading evidence gathering missions in countries that commit, allow, or even cordon human rights. Terry, good to have you join us on the NC Debrief.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate your interest.
Well, quite frankly, you have a very strong academic and clinical education background, but again, the interest about what you're doing on the continent is what is making us have this conversation. And quite frankly, no, you explore the Alien Tort Claims Act. Now, perhaps if you can put that in lucid terms, break it down so that we can do away with all of those jargons. How has this, been for you, looking at the restrictions that were established in the Cobalt versus Shell ruling, especially in Nigeria?
Well, we have this law, the Alien Tort Statute, that goes back to our very first Congress in 1789. And it's a very simple law. It says that an alien can sue in U.S. courts for a violation of the law of nations. And the law of nations is a term of art that essentially means violations that all civilized countries agree to. So things like slavery, torture, genocide, extrajudicial killing. So we are using it to go after corporations that have slavery in their supply chains, even today, which is rather mind-boggling if you think about it. But we have two major cases in Africa. One is pending now in our U.S. Supreme Court against Nestle and Cargill for using child slaves and trafficked children to harvest cocoa in Cote d'Ivoire. And more recently, we have a case against Tesla, Apple, Dell, Microsoft, and Google for using cobalt mined in the Democratic Republic of Congo with forced child labor. The startling thing about both of these cases is that the companies cannot deny and do not deny that these horrible conditions we talk about are going on today in their supply chains. The companies are instead making very technical legal arguments that they are not responsible for what happens in their supply chains. So we have some of the richest corporations in the world in the Cobalt case benefiting from forced child labor. And they promise to consumers with codes of conduct and policy statements that they don't use child labor, but they do. And we're trying to hold them responsible.
It's quite a shame that this is happening in 2020. Would it be right for anyone to say this is modern day slavery?
I think it would be right to say that it's good old-fashioned slavery, that these conditions that these children work under in both cobalt and in cocoa, there's not much difference between how they're doing it today and how slaves were operating 200-300 years ago. Primitive tools, abuse of the children, treating them like property. So that is a shocking thing. But yes, you're correct, of course, that these various UN agencies, UNICEF and so on, they're trying to make it relevant by calling these kinds of conditions modern day slavery, but it's plain and simple slavery. And the biggest companies in the world are profiting from it. And in our complaint in the Cobalt case, we reference Adam Hochfeld's book, fabulous book called King Leopold's Ghost, about the Congo. And King Leopold, as most of you will sadly recall, came to the Congo in the late 1800s and first exploited people to get ivory out and then rubber out. And the conditions that occurred then seem very similar to what's going on now. And we just continue to see this, I would call it modern day colonialism, where these big corporations are coming to Africa and stealing the resources and really leaving nothing good in return. That's what really we're talking about.
Terry, listening to you, you use the word big companies. Now we're talking about, multinational conglomerates going into such despicable act. Now, tell us about the particular case which you have going in Congo.
Well, in the Congo, Congo has approximately 70% of the world's cobalt. And every single gadget that the big tech companies make needs a lithium-ion battery that allows it to be recharged, and it retards the flammability of the battery, is an essential element in all of these gadgets. And then Tesla also uses the same cobalt in its batteries for its electric cars, as do the other electric car makers. I was invited by some local activists in the Congo. This was, first of all, a well-known phenomenon that Amnesty International and others have issued reports showing the horrible conditions in cobalt mines. And essentially, the two big mining companies that operate there, Glencore, which is a Swiss company, and Huayu, which is a Chinese company, they both have big industrial mining operations there, and they supply cobalt to the Tesla, Apple, Google, Dell, and Microsoft, and all of the other tech companies there. But in addition, there are adjacent mines called artisanal mines, where human beings tunnel into this cobalt rock, and it's like shale. It's very soft. It causes tunnel collapses as soon as you start digging into it. So we have children, and I have photos, and we've documented, there's no doubt that this is going on. Children are working in these mines and tunneling in, and the tunnels eventually collapse. There's no safety equipment, there's no support, there's no observations even of the dangerous conditions. And so every day these kids show up, they're essentially trafficked, they're gathered up by someone like a labor broker, and they go to work in these tunnels for about $1 a day. And they are working knowing that those tunnels eventually are going to collapse on them. And so my clients, I represent 15 families. 11 of them are children who were severely maimed after they were buried alive in a tunnel collapse. Some of them have amputated legs, crushed pelvises. They're never going to work again, and they don't get very good medical care. And then I represent 4 families who had a child who was buried alive and died. And they're asking me to help them get justice from the companies that are knowingly receiving this cobalt and doing absolutely nothing about it. And as you mentioned, these are not just regular companies. These are giant corporations. They brag. Apple is worth $1 trillion. Microsoft, $1 trillion. Tesla is well on its way. If they cared about this with all of their technological and resource power, they could go there tomorrow and solve this problem. But they're going to continue to do this as long as they can get away with it. That's what corporations do. They don't have a moral compass. And we are trying our best to put an end to this practice and get some justice for these families.
Well, it's all about justice. Terry, when we come back after the break, we will asking what the companies is saying now that you have approached them, possibly to find out what ethical or moral justification they have to have those children go through such despicable, condition in their place of operation. That will be after now. Well, welcome back. You're watching the NC Debrief, and today we're speaking with Terry Collingsworth. Now, these companies now, as we have highlighted before we went on that very short break, what are they saying? In as much as they try as much as sourcing for some of these materials, don't forget, also from the locals.
Yes. Well, the companies, we cynically call this the corporate playbook because I think there is one. I think all of the big companies, they watch what each does in these kinds of problem situations, what works and what doesn't work. And when we say work, we're talking about managing the public relations issue. That's all they care about. Instead of using resources to try to address the problems, they spend millions of dollars on public relations and advertising and developing policies that they can show to the consuming public and say, look, we're working on this, we have a solution. So I think the best example of this is the Cobalt cases. So these companies, Apple, Tesla, Microsoft, Dell, and Google, they know that their customer bases are sort of younger, woke people who wouldn't put up with a company that is using child slaves or abusing children, getting minerals from places where children are killed and maimed in getting those minerals out. So they have developed these very shiny policies that promise the world. Apple, for example, their policy says, we monitor every aspect of our supply chain and we send our teams to make sure that there is no child labor in any aspect of our productions. Well, that's just a plain lie. So I think the juxtaposition is interesting that they still today, when we sued them, they all 5 companies issued statements saying it's against our policy. We have a policy against using child slaves or child labor. And then they tell the court that they basically don't even know where the the Democratic Republic of Congo is. They claim they're too far removed from the supply chain to be legally responsible. Well, we, in our complaint and in our response to the court, we essentially rammed those policies down their throat and said, you can't have it both ways. Either you're lying about your policy or you are a criminal because you know that there's child labor in your supply chain and you're not doing anything about it. And I have worked on these issues, as you've mentioned, for 30 some years. The Cobalt issue would be one of the easiest I've ever experienced to fix. The Cobalt mines are in a very confined geographic area. There's not a million of them. There's 25 or 30 of them. And you could quickly identify those mines, make them safer, sponsor schools and get the kids out of the mines and into the schools, and use your tremendous resources to make the mines safer and create good jobs for adults that won't have to send their own kids to work because they're getting paid fairly. These companies could afford to do that. They could lead by example, but right now they're lying like the oil companies always have and claiming that they're just not responsible for what goes on.
You know, now that you just mentioned the oil companies, a case in mind is what we've seen here in Nigeria, talking about the Ogoni people that are still talking and asking for a cleanup in their community, in that vast area of land. Now, you've done several cases around human rights violations. Perhaps we should be asking what you think makes the people of the continent particularly vulnerable to these corporations. What do you think countries need to do to rise above that?
Well, I hate to ring the same bell that people have been talking about for a while, but in the Congo, there's a real history of just corruption. The government officials are paid to look the other way or have an interest in the mines and so on. So one of the things that needs to be done is just transparency in terms of the government transactions with the mining companies. There are, I think, credible allegations that Glencore in particular has bribed, and it's their method of doing business, of bribing government officials. Second, every country, including the Democratic Republic of Congo and Cote d'Ivoire, where the child labor case I have is cited, they have really good laws that prohibit child labor, that prohibit putting children to work in dangerous situations. So there isn't a law enforcement issue there. But I think at the end of the day, it's a dual problem. We have to, as consumers and regulators from the countries that these corporations are hiding in, we need to also take responsibility here and make them behave, which is what I'm trying to do. But I would sure like to see local governments really more transparently helping to expose the conditions and then taking people to justice in the Congo or Cote d'Ivoire that are shown to have been willing participants by accepting corruption and then doing nothing to help their own people.
Would it be right for us to say this is happening or these are happening because of failure of the local laws? Now we're talking about the laws in such countries. You also mentioned, a case of corruption, officials looking the other way, where there exists a law that truly, penalize, such violations. Is that why you're taking this, to reject this, the tort law that once upon a time has been called a dusty law?
Yes, absolutely. So I think from both ends, if you want to solve this problem, you have to improve transparency and law enforcement in the countries where the violations are occurring. And then we have to penalize and take the profit out of allowing our Western corporations to go in and take advantage of this system that they not only know about, but they've really learned to manipulate very well.
Most of these companies, they have their own legal unit, lawyers, experts who definitely will advise them about the alien tort. And how do these companies rise above, trying to avoid litigation, which they are enmeshed in at the moment, to doing what's necessary to ensure ethical and human practices?
Well, that's an excellent question. I think that they all do a cost-benefit analysis at some point and say the risk of getting sued is still less expensive than actually going in and cleaning up the problem. That's because they don't have a moral compass. They have an economic compass, and that's it, maximizing profits. And that's what drives them. And I think the cases that I engage in are really graphic examples of that. For example, the Nestle case that we have on child slaves in cocoa, we first sued them in the year 2005. And now on December 1st, our case, after many trips to various courts of appeal, will be in the U.S. Supreme Court. The argument is scheduled for December 1st. I would estimate that these companies have spent $30 to $50 million on legal fees defending this action. And if they had taken that $30 to $50 million on day one and worked with us to try to solve the problem, it would have been solved. So that's a shame. And they have these giant law firms that bill by the hour, and they must do celebratory high fives whenever I sue one of their clients, because they know it's going to be a long battle and the lawyers are going to get real rich off it. That's another sort of unfortunate reverse incentive system that operates in our courts.
Let's see if we can close on this, and it's about you and your team. And I'm a little bit worried, knowing full well that whatever you're doing, Terry, is commendable. Yes, we have to say this to you, but how do you go about these cases, from one country and another? We're talking about funding. Who helps Terry and his team?
Well, we in the United States, we have a really fantastic tradition of pro bono lawyering, where lawyers of goodwill will come together and volunteer their time to work on cases together. So I always manage to put together a team of outstanding lawyers that can go toe-to-toe with any of these big firms, and we have for years. We always are facing funding crises because we don't have the $1 trillion net worth of the companies that we sue. But we get donations from individuals, from foundations, and if anybody wants to help with these issues on our website, iradvocates.org, you can also join the team. But we can do a lot with little because we're dedicated and focused. And I want to add that we're not what I would call carpetbaggers. I never take a case where I have not been invited by a local organization to come in and try to help them solve their problem. And I'm proud to have worked with and helped really develop some of these legal teams all over the world. And that is part of our lasting legacy, I hope.
Terry Collingsworth, many thanks for speaking with us on human rights violations on the continent and how we can seek justice.
Thank you so much for your interest, and I'm very happy to reach your audience today. Thank you.
Well, that's it on NC Debrief today. I'm Sulaiman, Aledeh. Next week is another focus right here.